that part again?
Oh, yes. My mother's Jewish, and half my family are Jewish, cousins and my grandparents, uh, and I knew them well. And we visited a lot and spent time together. I loved them and respected them, and knew what good people they were. And I also knew that Jewish people were not the common run of the society. Uh, and I do not have remembrances of instances in which I knew that they were discriminated against. In fact, I had a cousin who later was president of the country club in Greenville, Mississippi. Well, that was at a time that in Clarksdale, Mississippi, a town north of Greenville, but also a town in the Delta counties, Jewish people were not allowed in the country club at all. But in any event, I knew that the Jewish people were not in all respects like everybody else. I admired them, and I think I caught on to the fact that a minority group are just as worthwhile as anybody else. And I'm guessing, this is something I thought about much later, I understand, but I'm guessing that in some subtle way influenced kind of my thinking about things. And I knew, well, but I'd said before that the society in which I grew up, and at the time I grew up, racial segregation was a way of life, and there were not many people around who were questioning or challenging that. And there are people I remember who I thought were very admirable people, and I don't know, 10 years later, 20 years later, I don't know what their ideas about, especially state-mandated racial segregation, what that would have been. I know I remember hearing my father say in the 1960s that African Americans should be allowed to vote. And that was, say, about 1963, I think. I remember a particular conversation. And because he was born in 1902, and he grew up in a racially segregated society. Nevertheless, he made judgments of individual people, I think, not necessarily of a class.
So could you put some context to your returning to the University of Mississippi as on faculty? Could you contextualize that? What was going on at the university at that time, and who was in leadership?
I joined the faculty in June of 1966. I had been invited to the law school along with a number of other young lawyers in Mississippi in the school year of 1965, 66, to help with the legal writing program. We had a particular role of dealing with students in that, and got to know faculty members and also the dean. I did not know the dean of the law school at that time, Josh Morse, because when I had finished law school in 1962, Bob Farley was still the dean, but Farley was in effect on the way of being pushed out. And the law school things had changed at the law school considerably. The main thing that had changed was that Josh Morse, who had been a lawyer in Poplarville, Mississippi, which is where he grew up, that's in South Mississippi, had left his law practice and come to the law faculty in, I don't know right now, about 1964 or so. And then that's about the time that Bob Farley was, and I say pushed out because the politically reactionary people on the IHL board, Institutions of Higher Learning board, really did push him out. The chancellor of the university was told what to do by them, but anyway, Morse, I think, spent a year at the law school. Then he went to Yale Law School, and that was fairly common back in those days, because I can remember my 5th semester in law school. Bob Farley called me in his office. The dean called me in his office and said, I and the faculty would like for you to stay on next year and teach with us, and then the next year go to Yale to get an LLM degree, Yale Law School. And there was a long-time connection between the University of Mississippi School of Law and the Yale Law School. And I told him at the time that I think maybe I'd like to teach sometime, but not then. And but by the time when Josh Morse was there, when I first knew him in the 1965-66 year, he had come back from Yale, and 2 or 3 things had happened. A lot of young faculty members had been, a few had been hired, and more were in the offing of being hired. And that was because he had obtained from the Ford Foundation a large grant of money. It turned out, I think, to be a 5-year grant of money, but it gave the law school money to enlarge the faculty. Another thing that had happened was that the law school had begun recruiting black students for law study, and with some of that Ford Foundation money, offering scholarships to black students. Well, that was a huge change in the society of Mississippi. I thought then, and still think, the law school was on the cutting edge of social change at that time. The university itself was trying to recover from the bad publicity and experience of the riots after the Meredith admission in October of 1962. And there were the racial tensions in this country in 1968, just a little later than that. It was a year when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. There were race riots in many, many cities. But this that kind of tension, partly race, partly based on the Vietnam War that was protested by many people, but it created a great deal of tension on college campuses, and it showed up at the University of Mississippi as well, not as extreme as at many other schools. So the law school was surely in a period of transition at that time, and as was the university. But the law school was a exciting place to be. Lots of students. It also was a time, when I came, was a time that law school enrollments all over the country had begun to increase dramatically. And so there were a lot of students, a lot of very, very good students, quite a mix of students. So that was something of the context when I joined the faculty.
And can you tell us about the founding of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services under Dean Morse and your own involvement in that?
Yeah, and I was not in on the ground floor discussions about the establishment of the legal services program, but the legal services program was established at the law school, by the law school, and it was established with part of that. I think it was not the Ford Foundation grant, because I think what had happened is that Josh Morse had gotten a grant from the, I think it was called the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, and to establish a legal services program. And it would have 2 functions. It would provide legal services for indigent people in the North Mississippi area, people who could not otherwise afford legal representation. And also it would establish a clinical, what we call a clinical program, in which law students, especially second and third year law students, would work with lawyers who were representing indigent clients. And so both those were part of it. Uh, and this is something I don't have firsthand or complete information about it, but I want to tell you about it. When Josh Morse was at Yale Law School that year, he came to know this man and woman, Gene and Edgar Kahn, K-A-H-N, and they ran a legal services program in New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven is where Yale University is located and the law school is located. I think they are the ones who put him in touch with the OEO to eventually get the grant for the law school that allowed the law school to operate the legal services program. I think they, Gene and Edgar Kahn, did other things. They probably put him in touch with or helped put him in touch with the people at the Ford Foundation. Again, I don't know that for sure, but I've heard their name. I don't know either of them. I know a little of their subsequent careers. I think that's also how it came that Bobby Kennedy came to speak at the University of Mississippi in the spring of 1966 at the invitation of the Law Students Speakers Bureau. I think Edgar Kahn, who had worked for Bobby Kennedy, I think was probably instrumental in putting the law school in touch with Bobby Kennedy and his coming here. But then so the program was started probably around 1966. I'm not even certain of that. It could have been the next year, but I think possibly that year. And the program was of a type that was at that time called Judicare. And it really meant that there was a administrative officer of the program, and he would engage local area lawyers to represent indigent clients. And then he and perhaps his staff would screen potential clients and send them to these different lawyers. But these were local lawyers who provided the legal representation of the clients. And there's a man named Aaron Condon who came to the law school about the time I did, and he had come from a law practice in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, and he was the one who was the administrative officer of that program. And the program operated like that for a time, and I don't know if it was 1 year, 2 years, or more, but some of the law faculty members who had experience with another legal services program did not think it was operating very well, did not think it was providing good quality, high quality legal services. And here's who these people were. These were people who were recent graduates of Yale Law School, and they had been at Yale Law School at second year students probably, when Josh Morse was there. Josh Morse was there as a graduate student in what was called LLM, Master of Laws. And there were 5 of the people from Yale Law School, fresh graduates, who came to the law faculty the same year I did. One was Mike Trister, and one was George Strickler, and Walter Dellinger, and Fred McLean, and Joe Chubb. They were the 5 who came. Well, some of those, especially Mike Trister and George Strickler, were very, very active in this legal services program. And they were the ones who had experience I assume at the New Haven, Connecticut Legal Services Program, and they thought there was a better way to do it. And the way they wanted to have the program operate was with staff lawyers, rather than farm the cases out to practicing lawyers in town. They thought if there were staff lawyers, those lawyers would have as their main purpose, their only purpose, for serving these clients, and that they could develop an expertise in those branches of law that were needed to help their clients. And so the program was changed from this one form to the staff lawyer model. And I was on the board of directors at the time of the change. I remember that. I don't remember all the details about it, but I remember knowing that this was quite a change, and in my view, likely to be a much more effective legal services program. So that was sometime around, I don't know, 67 or 68, thereabouts. And then I continued on the board of directors. I was asked at that time, mainly because I was a lawyer from Mississippi, I think, and was involved somewhat, to become director of this program, the staff attorney program. And I declined. I enjoyed practicing law when I had practiced, and I was really enjoying teaching in the law school. So I wanted to continue with the teaching as my emphasis. Then Josh Morris left the law school in 1969, and he too was pushed out by a political reactionary group, and that was made up the majority of the political ends and the people with political power in the state at that time. And one thing that had happened was that Josh Morris had become unpopular with many of the alumni and other lawyers in the state, and the political, I call them political reactionaries, because bringing this large group of lawyers, some of which from outside, actually there was many new faculty members, or more new faculty members from within the state as from without. But these others were lightning rods. And but he was unpopular for that. Josh Morris was unpopular because it was very clear that recruiting black law students was something that had not been done at southern universities at all. And then it turned out the staff attorney form of the legal services program was aggressive and unpopular, because they ended up providing representation against well-to-do people and business interests in various towns. But then when they represented clients in Holly Springs and perhaps Marshall County otherwise, but I know filed a school desegregation suit against the Holly Springs. It was against the Holly Springs School Board, but also against the state of Mississippi. And so as a technical matter, part of the argument was, well, they are out of place because here is a branch of the state institution, this legal services program of the law school, suing the state, and that's improper. I mean, that was an argument that was made, but it really was the substance of it that was a sensitive subject, and that's kind of what gave the people who opposed to Josh Morris the political clout to push him out. There had been a lot of pressure on him all along, and I knew that very well. and he left and went to a law school at Florida State University. So, I mean, he landed on his feet and stayed there a long time as dean and later on the faculty. He's not living now, but he's only, I've forgotten exactly when his death was, but within the past probably 6 years. So, and then I left the law school faculty in 1970, and I went to be a visiting faculty member at Florida State Law School. I stayed there for 2 years, and I came back to the University of Mississippi Law Faculty. And I had been a member of the board of directors of this program up until the time I left, and then shortly after I came back, I went to the Office of Legal Services, and I got an appointment with the man who was the director at the time, Francis Stevens. I did not know him, and I just went in, introduced myself, and but anyway, I ended up back on the board, and I think I was for a period of about 20 years, total of 20 years on the board, and it was a long association that I cared a lot about, made a lot of good friends, and thought I was doing something worthwhile.
I want to go back to the board specifically, but I wondered if you could think back to the earliest years of legal services and reflect on the pressures that were on Dean Morse. Were those same pressures, being placed upon the staff and the organizers and the lawyers participating? How was it like working politically in that atmosphere with these issues at that early time?
Well, as you can imagine, those issues did not change. And when Josh Morse left as dean, let's see. Yeah, when Josh Morse left as dean, the IHL board, as I recall it, when I refer to IHL, Institution of Higher Learning, it's the governing board of the state-operated colleges and universities in the state, required the then dean, who was Bill Bunkley, to say to 3 faculty members who were part-time, they had become part-time teaching in the law school. They had already been teaching in the law school, already on the law school faculty. But by this time, they were part-time teaching. The other part of their time, they were staff attorneys with the program. One of them, Luther McDougall, was the chairman, was the director, executive director. So it was Luther McDougall, Mike Trister, and George Strickler. And they were required to do one of two things: either come back full-time to the law school, or leave the law faculty if they wanted to stay with legal services. But the mandate was that they could not do both. They could not both be on the law faculty and be lawyers in legal services. And Luther McDougall decided to come back to the law faculty. And then his uncle, incidentally, Myers McDougall, was a longtime faculty member at the Yale Law School, and one of the he'd been president of the Association of American Law Schools, and was a big name in legal scholarship. Luther later left this law school. He went to Arizona, the law school, University of Arizona. Then he later went to Tulane Law School on the faculty. Luther really had in mind an academic career, and so he had left the legal services, come back to the law school. The other two, Mike Trister and George Strickler, filed suit against the university, saying that they were being denied equal protection of the law by having to make that choice, that was improper choice. They should not be required to leave the faculty in order to do the legal services work. And there were other faculty members, not many, but a few other faculty members who were part-time. There was a lawyer who taught estate tax and estate planning, who was a lawyer in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and he taught part-time at the law school. And that was one example. And it turned out the court agreed with them. And so there was a court order that the court had to rescind that mandate. The university had to rescind that mandate given to them. They could remain on the law faculty and practice with legal services. And indeed, both of those people, Mike Tristan and George Strickler, were very good lawyers, important in the life of this legal services program. And Mike Tristan was selected as the executive director after Luther McDougall, and continued as executive director for several years. I've forgotten just how long. But that was the way in which the political pressure showed up.
Was there ever any sense of physical danger among some of the early organizers and participants of legal services?
I don't know. I frankly don't know. I was young and I knew nothing would happen to me. I mean, just because I was young and inexperienced, and luckily I was right. I don't remember having any threats. I do remember this, going to the state bar convention and being called in by some committee of the state bar and asked a lot of questions about the legal services program. And one thing, and I was a member of the board of directors. I did not know all the details of the operation, but what they really were getting at, I think, is that the program had not only staff lawyers, but also individuals who were not lawyers. They were called community workers. I think that's the term, community workers. And I knew a number of those, who came to know a number of those people. Well, they were people who would go talk to, they knew the people in the community and who might need legal help. Well, the accusation was that they were drumming up business. They were soliciting legal business, and soliciting business was unethical. Well, these people were wrong in that it's not unethical for a nonprofit organization to do that kind of thing. But, and I don't know, they may have known that, but they were complaining about it, in effect. And, in effect, they were complaining to me. Again, I did not feel vulnerable. And it was probably because I didn't know enough. I was just too self-confident, I suppose. But I did not know of legal threats. I mean, physical threats, I should say.
Thank you. So going back to your time on the board, could you tell me more about how those years you served on the board, like the evolution of the organization, just a general picture of that from a board member's perspective?
Yeah, well, from a board member's perspective, one thing that happened, it caused a change in the program, is this. John Bell Williams was elected as the governor of Mississippi in I've forgotten now which election in the 1960s that was, but he was as much of a political reactionary as far to the right as any governor of modern times. And there was a provision in the federal law pertaining to the grant. Well, anyway, pertaining to the grant that could have allowed him to veto the grant, but he could not veto the grant, a grant to an educational institution. But any grant under that whole program, it was more than legal services, the governor of the state could veto it, except could not veto a grant to an educational institution. Well, one thing that happened to this program that the law school was operating is this, that after that lawsuit was filed against the Holly Springs School Board, the law school was required to give up the grant, or I say the university, because it was a grant to the university for the law school's program. But the political pressure from the IHL board on the chancellor of the university was such that they were required to give up the grant. So arrangements were made, and I was not part of this, but arrangements were made for Mary Holmes College in West Point, Mississippi, to become the grantee from the OEO, from the Office of Educational Opportunity, of this grant. And that's one the governor could not veto. So anyway, the program then changed. It was no longer, this is after, this is about 1969 there. The program was not directly connected with the law school at that time. But the grant, during some of those years, the funding was, I don't know if I think the funding probably was growing. And one thing that happened is that the program had as its area virtually all of North Mississippi. There's something like 40 counties, and 2/3 of the people in those counties were poor people. That is, they were people who could qualify for free legal services. Also, it happened that of the African American population in those counties, about 2/3 of them were poor enough so they could qualify. So many of the clients were African American, not all of them by any means, but many were. But the funding was substantial enough that the program grew, because I remember we started off with the office in Oxford, and subsequently opened an office in Holly Springs, Mississippi. One time had an office in Greenville, Mississippi. I think maybe Clarksdale, is that right? We had a Clarksdale office. But anyway, we had like 5 offices in North Mississippi, different places in North Mississippi, and attorneys in all of those offices, maybe 2 attorneys, not huge numbers, but the program was reasonably well funded, enough so that it could expand the offering of legal services. And at a later time, there were various forms of political pressure that were put to try to curtail this kind of operation, not just this program, but other legal services programs as well, and it was very much a political topic. I can remember Senator Eastland at one time making an inquiry, Senator James O. Eastland, longtime United States Senator from Mississippi, and chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee for a long time. But I can remember on one occasion, somebody had made some kind of complaint about the program, and Senator Eastland had written a letter to the program, probably got to the board. And I can remember being involved in making investigation of whatever it was that was charged. And then I can remember writing or helping write the report or the letter back to Senator Eastland about what we had done, what we had found. But that was, that was not ordinary. That was prompted as a politically prompted inquiry. And I don't know how many of those there were, but because I was not, front line, I was not in the office, in the legal services office. But just because the politics of the state were so very conservative, and this is a program that was running against the tide, it was unpopular. The program was unpopular politically and otherwise with many, many people.
Could you talk more about the makeup of the board and some, it's my understanding that a percentage of the board had to be represented by people who were clients, is that right?
Right.
And could you talk about that dynamic, of attorneys and clients and how the board operated?
Yeah, and that business about the representation on the board of directors is something that I think Mike Tristan and George Strickler had introduced that. And I think it was because they had experience with another legal services program, and that was part of the philosophy, that you don't want just a bunch of lawyers making up a board of directors, but you want involvement from the community people at the board level. And so I think, I've forgotten exactly, but I think it was that a majority of the board had to be lawyers, but community representatives could elect members from their geographic area to be members of the board. Or they could nominate. I've forgotten exactly how that happened. So the makeup of the board was some lawyers, all of whom, in my recollection, at the time I was on the board, were very friendly to the concept of providing good quality legal representation to indigent people. And then other people on the board were community members. And I, of course, because I was on the board a long time, I came to know many of them and loved them and found very colorful, wise characters among them. There was one woman from Oxford, Mrs. Quarles, and Mrs. Quarles was not an educated person, but she was very much interested in community participation in the political process. And she was, understatement was not her form of address. And she's a charming person and a colorful person. And her son and my son happened to be in junior high school together about that time. I remember that. And there were other people. Wayne Johnson was a man from Oxford, a minister from Oxford who was a long-time chairman of the board, a very staunch and capable person. Both of those were community representatives. And in fact, during my time on the board, most of the time, the chairperson of the board was a community member as opposed to a lawyer. Not the entire time, because I remember later on there was a lawyer from West Point, Mississippi, Benny. Help me, Jenny. What's Benny?
I was trying to think of.
Anyway, he was chairman of the board. He probably had been my student when he was in law school. He was in the state legislature, very able.
Benny Turner?
Benny Turner. Benny Turner was a lawyer who was chairman of the board for several years. So it was not all community people, but there was a community leader from Holly Springs, Mississippi, Skip Robinson. And Skip Robinson was not a lawyer. He was a bricklayer, a carpenter, and a very able man who was chairman of the board for a number of years as well.
Do you have any anecdotes of any of those people that you would like to share?
Well, I tell you one thing I remember. On one occasion, we had a scheduled board meeting at West Point, Mississippi, and it was at the time that probably the time that Mary Holmes College was a grantee. But anyway, we had an office in West Point, and West Point was not exactly central, no place was central, but it was a good place to have a meeting. So we had a board meeting scheduled there, and Wayne Johnson, who was a chairman from Oxford, and Mildred Quarles, a board member from Oxford, were going to the meeting, and I was going, and there's a young man whose name I can't come up with now, but he was a member of the political science faculty at the university. He was a junior member of the university political science faculty, but he was a member. He was a white guy, and Mildred Quarles and Wayne Johnson, both African Americans. But anyway, Wayne was driving. He was driving us over there. Well, his car broke down between Pontotoc and Okolona, I think. And so there we were, stranded out on the road late afternoon. And we decided that we could hitchhike on to West Point, but we would best do it if we had two. It was easier for two people to catch a ride than for four. And we'd be safer doing it if two white guys and then two black people were hitchhiking separately. And so we did that, and we all caught a ride. We got there in good time. Then, and we were very jolly about it. Wayne was the one who had hit because his car, but he made some arrangements to get his car towed, I think. But then we came back, and Skip Robinson from Holly Springs had driven some people in. I think he had a carload, but he took at least two more. We all just piled in. Had again a jolly ride home, but and we thought not much of it, you know. And although when we talked about hitchhiking, we realized that there were rednecks. We called them rednecks back then. The rednecks could come by, and people had a rifle, a shotgun in the pickup truck, and could just. But we realized that, and we had good enough sense to pair off by two African Americans, two white people, to get to hitchhike. Hitchhiking was not unusual back in those days, and that was probably sometime in the, I don't know if it was in the 70s or the 80s, probably in the 70s.
Great. Could you talk about some specific cases or you know, legal battles that legal services fought on behalf of people, local people? What are some of the most important ones during your tenure?
Yeah, you know, that's something I should know, but in truth, I was a member of the board, and we were the governing board, and we were not involved in the litigation, and properly so. We had staff attorneys, very people who were capable and who developed expertise in their fields, and they handled those things. And we, I don't remember in the board meetings even talking about specific kinds of legal work that was being done. Some was litigation, some was not litigation, other forms. But I don't, I was not involved at that level. I know the lawyers were very busy. There were plenty of clients, and there were pressing legal problems that they were dealing with, from landlord-tenant to employment and a variety of other domestic relations, quite a variety of legal work. But I happened, and I may have known about it at the time, those cases, but I don't remember it.
Okay. Could you reflect on what you think the impact of legal services was on the legal landscape in the state of Mississippi?
Well, from the standpoint of indigent clients, and their legal needs, the needs they had for legal representation, they were served where otherwise they would not have been served. They got help and representation where they would not have. And it's not that individual lawyers would not take a free case. They would, but there's not a lot of that. Plus, one important factor of this program having community workers, these are kind of people in the nature of social workers. They were in touch with people in the community, and people trusted them. And they would trust then that the lawyers that were going to represent them had the best interests of the clients in mind. And that is not something that always occurs in an indigent population, because if people in the indigent population go to a local lawyer, they may not trust that local lawyer well, and often they did, and had good reason to trust, but not in quite the same way that they thought the legal services lawyers were definitely on their side. And I think that is an important factor, and that would affect the legal community at the ground level, as the people who get the service. So far as the lawyers are concerned, lawyers around the state, around this area where these legal services lawyers practice, came to know them and to respect the fact that they did good legal work. And I think gradually there was an acceptance of the proper place of the legal services lawyers among lawyers, even among these lawyers who were may earlier have been most likely to be hostile to the whole notion, to that whole. And the same thing about judges. Judges were not, and many of the legal services lawyers were African Americans. Not all of them by any means, but many of them were African Americans. And the judges in the state, especially the state court judges, were not accustomed to seeing African American lawyers. And I know the African American lawyers for the program had to tread very gently to get acceptance. If a lawyer is going to represent the client well, then they did not want to antagonize a judge, so they had to try to get along with the judges. And I think that's something that gradually came to be, that state court judges accepted these lawyers regardless of their race and regardless of who they're representing. So I think my own view is it's been a very positive fact of life.
What about other people, maybe that we haven't talked about yet, that you think were important in the history of the organization, particularly during your tenure on the board?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier Mike Trister, and unfortunately Mike Trister died within the past year. George Strickler was important in the very early days, but then George left this program, and I've forgotten exactly. He ended up on the Tulane law faculty. I know that, but I think he's not there now. Benny Turner, who's a lawyer in West Point, an African-American lawyer in West Point, who was in the state legislature, and who was chairman of the board for a number of years, but unfortunately he's not living now either. And some of these other people I mentioned, Wayne Johnson, Mildred Quarles, are not available, not living either. Skip Robinson is not living. And that's because I go way back. I'm talking about a time in the late 60s and throughout the 70s and well into the 80s. So a lot of these people were well along at the time. Bennett, well, let me say that of the current people at the Legal Services Program, the executive director has been both a lawyer in the program for a good length of time, then director for a good length of time, and he has had experience. Jenny Kilgore, who was a student in my class at the law school, one or more classes in law school, then maybe came directly from law school to the Legal Services Program, and has developed expertise, especially in what's called elder law, and has trained many lawyers, and continues, I think, to train lawyers at the law students at the law school, but has offered that as a segment of a component of this program, very valuable to clients. That's usually not a litigation kind of practice, but that's something that people need. I should be able to come up with a lot more names, and I don't right now.
Okay. Any final thoughts? Anything that you would like to share that we haven't covered?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing I mentioned. I failed to mention early on. The program, both at the law school and later, was reasonably well funded, and that was federal funds, federal government funds. And two things happened. The budget, and at one time there was a part of the federal government, I don't know if it was, I'm not sure which department it was in, but it was Office of, we call it the Legal Services Office, I think. And so we would deal directly with them. That was the administrative agency that dealt with legal services grantees all over the country. But their funding gradually was reduced, and it just seemed that every few years, it got chopped a little more. Another thing that happened is that, and that's partly political. Another thing that happened is the kind of work the legal services programs could undertake on behalf of clients was restricted. For example, class action litigation, which is a very efficient form of representing in a single lawsuit a lot of people who have essentially the same problem. I think that was completely eliminated from things that the legal services program could do. And I think there were a few other strictures. It always had been a stricture that the program could not take a fee-producing suit. If there was likely to be a money recovery of any size, the program would have to pass that along to a private lawyer. But legal services has not been a front burner important program for the federal government to fund as it was in the 60s and into the 70s. that's gradually shrunk, and these political pressures have put strictures on legal services programs. And the programs have soldiered on. They have, in some cases, found some other sources of grant funds, support funds, but they also have lived on a shoestring, I think, in providing legal services. So I think and I hope that the worth of the programs has been well enough proven that they will not go away.